It's a well-known fact that brewers make wort and yeast turns that wort into beer. Now, in this day and age, we have available to us myriad options for yeast, though it wasn't long ago folks looking to make beer at home had only the small packet of dry yeast taped to the underside of the lid that covered their can of extract. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and in this episode, contributor Matt Del Fiacco joins me to talk about dry yeast.
Yeah, man, and that's a great example that you just brought up, right? That there's, we all maybe started out with like a Mr. Beer kit, and we had some dry yeast taped to the underside of an extract kit, like a pre-hopped extract, and we talk all the time about how, modern practices and modern technology and has changed the way that ingredients are used and the way they're available to us and all those things. And dry yeast is probably my favorite example of that.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. When I tell people that I started brewing back in 2003, it's pretty common that they ask me about what about the yeast that I was using. I must have gotten lucky because when the shop that I bought my stuff at sold liquid yeast, and they really spoke poorly of dry yeast. My understanding is that they had some pretty gnarly experiences with the stuff that comes on the bottom of the can lid. And so I developed kind of this bias against dry yeast, which I'm sure was shared by a few people until fairly recently.
Definitely. I mean, when I started brewing way later than you, I started brewing in like 2012 or something like that. And even when I switched to all grain brewing, I still had some people recommending dry yeast to me because I couldn't make starters. I didn't have the things in place to get enough viability out of a liquid yeast pack. So everyone told me just use dry yeast. Dry yeast has a ton of cells in it. You're going to be fine.
Yeah.
So even in that short amount of time, it really, the technology changed the game of how we use dry yeast. And even since then, it's come so far.
Absolutely.
So it's so great.
Yeah. Dry yeast is very, very popular. There's a bunch of rules that, again, air quotes, some rules that go around
rules.
But we've put some of that to the test. We're going to talk about that in this show. But first, we're going to be hanging out at a bunch of rad events here in the near future, and we'd love to hang out with anyone else who might be attending these. Matt, you're going to be collecting experiment data at August 18th at Chaos Homebrew Club's Summer Brewbarbecue.
That's it. I'm going to be at the Brewbarbecue. It's going to be in right in Chicago with the Chaos Homebrew Club. At their little clubhouse brewing space. There's going to be a bunch of other clubs there. It's going to be a recommended donation, and I'm also going to be pouring a couple ciders and some other stuff just for fun. So I highly encourage people to attend. It's going to be awesome.
Yeah, man. I was checking out their Facebook page, and that just looks like a dope event. It's so
going to be
much
great.
Fun.
Yeah. There's a lot of clubs pouring, a lot of guys who I've had the pleasure of working with in the past. And so it's just going to be a riot. I'm so excited.
Right on, man. I'm excited for you. I'm a little bit jealous I can't make it, but I will be up in Yakima with Brian Hall at the end of September for Hop Harvest and to attend the Fresh Hop Ale Festival on September 29th. We're also going to be recording some shows, hanging out at Varietal Beer Company. While we're up there, it's going to be a good time. And then finally, Denny Kahn and I are going to be leading a couple seminars on experimentation and brewing for the Brew Your Own Boot Camp in Asheville, North Carolina. This happens all the way in March of 2019, but you can apparently register now, so get on it if you plan to attend. Those tickets go pretty fast. Hey, we're always looking for beer drinkers to participate in our experiments. If you live anywhere near any of us, we'd love to get you involved. We've got contributors all the way up in Anchorage, Alaska, Chicago, Illinois, Denver, Colorado, Pueblo, Colorado, Corona, California, Atlanta, Georgia, and Fresno, California. Shoot me an email, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and I'll connect you with the contributor who lives closest to you. If you're looking for an easy way to help us out, you can head over to brewlosophy.com/support, where you'll find a list of links to use when you shop online. Thanks to everyone who's been doing that. It really does help a ton. We also offer rewards for your support. By becoming a patron of Brewlosophy, you're going to receive things like unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, a chance to win a $50 Love to Brew gift certificate, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A with a special guest, among other things. Coming up next month is Malt Master Seth Klon from Mecca Great Estate Malt. Super cool dude who really knows his way around some grains. The list of upcoming guests includes Russian River's Vinny Chilurzo, Dr. Charlie Bamforth from the UC Davis Brewing Program, and more. All of that just for helping us out a little bit. It's pretty cool. Learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/brewlosophy. Okay, time for some feedback, which this week is brought to you by our friends from Imperial Yeast, who are providing brewers with the finest quality yeast on the market. Packing 200 billion cells into each pitch-right pouch, brewers are ensured a quick and healthy fermentation. With a wide range of ale and lager strains, as well as some funkier stuff, Imperial Yeast is sure to have what you need to turn your wort into delicious beer. Go check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer at imperialyeast.com. brewlasvi.com today. So on the show that we did live from Portland, we spent some time discussing a very unique Norwegian beer that seems to be gaining some popularity right now, the name of which we struggled to pronounce properly. Well, listener Bjorn Bjornsson, who is from Norway, wrote in with a little help. He says, being Norwegian, I can do this with some authority. The fast and easy way is to pronounce it quake. The Norwegian sound KV is pronounced very similar to the QU sound in English. In Norwegian, the sound a duck makes is written, now get this, KVAKK, and in English, it's quack. If you want to pronounce things more Norwegian-y, you need to meld the K and V into one sound. A KV sound, I'm guessing it's kv. In the podcast, you pronounced it kvik, which is like pronouncing quake. Q-wake.
Q-wake.
Yeah.
Quake.
So, yeah, exactly. So it's interesting. He says, the best of luck. I love your podcast, your write-ups, and all that sciencey things you do on behalf of all of us. Thank you so much, Bjorn. That's fascinating to me. I think the way I was saying it was kvik. I think he's pointing that out to me. And if I'm reading this correctly, it is quake.
I have honestly only ever said kvik.
You might be
just like really, really quick. I've said kvik.
So you might be saying it the more Norwegian-y way then, right? Because he says you need to meld the K and the V into one sound. Kvik.
Because like I'm still like I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but like I still have like a front thing where like my teeth are hitting my lips when I form like a V sound, like kvik. I don't think like it sounds like it's supposed to be quake. Like it's
that's how he wrote it out. Yeah.
Quake. Oh, that is so good to know. I've been mispronouncing this for at least 2 years now.
Oh yeah, I guarantee you I'm going to continue mispronouncing.
It's been so long. Oh my gosh.
Well, I do appreciate clarifications like that. Let us know how you say quake or any other words that we're saying wrong. You can write us in, give us some feedback, and school us. That's totally fine. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlasvi.com or leave us a voice message by calling 951-444-0320. So I think most of our listeners out there are very well aware that my friends and I are fans of crisp, easy drinking light lagers. Well, homebrewer Will Watson, who just happens to be in town right now, which is nuts, aka Hi Hat Brewing, sent us an American light lager that he brewed for review.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
What do you think of the color?
Looks like,
Let's just not ever assess color again. Let's go right to smell.
Smells like the color.
Let's go right to the taste.
It doesn't taste like anything.
Oh, that's not a good beer.
It tastes like a Coors Light.
That's not what you want in beer, I don't think. That tastes like a Coors Light.
I would drink it.
I'm not going to put this in the category of best being learned men, but what we've decided is anything that tastes like Coors Light, we say the word Pilsner, whether it's right or not.
All right. Pilsner.
So let's call it, this is definitely a Pilsner.
Smooth.
And then Marshall's going to be like, it's a Leffe Autobahn Pilsner. It's good.
Yeah,
but, but
you could drink a bunch
it's
of them.
good for the genre.
I get a little more. Nice.
Why are you pouring us more? It's good for a light beer. I have a smorgasbord of, like beer tastes now. We could shotgun this. Let's take it down.
Oh, God. It's good.
Yeah, it's good. It's Pilsner.
It's Pilsner.
As we become more learned, I refuse to say things like Miller or Coors Light anymore. That was the early Jersey Tim. You know what? For the genre of possibly Pilsner, I give it 4 Jersey Tims.
Yeah, 4 or 5. Yeah.
Yeah, 4 or 5 Jersey
Tims.
Tims. Yeah, that's what we give it. And we don't care what it is. We don't even care.
No, I don't care about it.
Okay, well, we've had a few of Will's beers so far, and I have to say that this one was probably one of the better ones, in my opinion. He does a lot of weird stuff with his beers. If you've ever watched his videos, I think he puts them on Facebook and whatnot. He has. I think he did like a Doritos nacho chip type of beer one time, stuff like that. I'm not entirely sure what his process was for this American light lager, but the beer was really great. And as an aside, I just want to congratulate Will and his new fiance, Erica Henderson, on their recent engagement. I happened to catch the video. Congratulations, Will. I happened to catch the video of Will proposing to Erica on a boat. And I'm kind of a sap and thought it was really adorable. So congrats, you two. I'm looking forward to hopefully hanging out soon because I know you guys are in town. So if you want your beer or any other fermented beverage that you make or feel like sending in to be reviewed by Jersey and Tim on the show, email me, marshall@brewlasvi.com, and we will get you all set up. We'll be right back with talk about dry yeast. Shopping for brewing supplies online can be a real hassle, which is why we recommend Love to Brew. They've got great prices, super fast shipping, and they carry exclusive products like East Coast Yeast, the Brewers Essentials brand, and their award-winning beer recipe kits. They're also the only place you can pick up your very own Brewlosophy recipe kit. The numbers don't lie. Love to Brew has hundreds of 5-star reviews, and thousands of brewers are choosing them for their supplies and ingredients each year. Experience the difference at lovetobrew.com. That's love, the number 2, brew.com. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you.
Hi, I'm Stephen Leach, creator of Brow Supply Brewing Systems, here to tell you about our latest Unibrow brewing system. Modeled after the brew-in-a-bag method, the Unibrow uses the same kettle for both mashing and boiling, replacing the fabric bag with a stainless basket that can hold up to 20 pounds of grain. A heating element is run by an electric controller that allows for the maintenance of specific mash temperatures and makes mashing easier than ever. Each Unibrow is shipped with a counterflow chiller and the parts required to brew a batch of beer. We're really proud of the Unibrow, and we know you'll love it as much as we do. Go check it out at browsupply.com and sign up for our email list to receive special deals in your inbox.
As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer, and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. For years, when I would think of dry yeast, images of little packs of a powdery substance my grandma used to bake bread would come to mind. Of course, dry brewer's yeast is incredibly popular right now, due primarily, I think, to its ease of use and also shelf stability. And while it may have developed a bit of a negative reputation for some time, it's got a pretty interesting history.
It is definitely interesting, and it has like a much longer history. I mean, like with all things brewing, right? You know, there are some suggestions that say dry yeast like has been utilized as far back as like a Roman culture for bread, where they would dry out dough and then would rehydrate it with water and sugar and use that as their yeast pitch for the next batch. I haven't found too many examples of that, so don't take that part too seriously. But what we do have a ton of evidence of, and if you've listened to this podcast before, and Marshall, you know this, I'm a real Lars blog nerd. I really love the work he does, and his dedication to things. And there is a lot of ample evidence that suggests brewers in Norway have been using dried yeast in some capacity for at least 400 years.
Speaking of Quake.
Yeah, exactly. Speaking of Quake, where thank God we can pronounce it properly now. But essentially, like what would happen is you would have wood sticks, which I suppose this would be I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. I'm going to say yeast log, but you'd.
That sounds delicious.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah, it's really appetizing. It's what you want to throw into your beer. But essentially, you'd have a wooden stick with holes in it that increase kind of that exposed surface area, and that would be rolled around in the yeast cake, dried a little bit, rolled around in the yeast cake, dried a little bit, and then as that was going on, you know, they'd be able to coat it, dry it, and then repitch that yeast into their next batch.
That is fascinating, kind of realization to be able to do that, particularly with what little I know about the way dry yeast is, like modern dry yeast is manufactured. I mean, that is so rudimentary, but it obviously works. And I know that in Norway, based on what I've read on Lars' blog, they still do that today.
Yeah, it's definitely a valid practice, and it's interesting because like there's different ways they've come about trying to make that a more sterile process. Because I'm sure, as you can imagine, like, and this is something that was historically true, that as you dried yeast outside of a sterile environment, you're also, there's other bacteria in the air, there's other things that you're getting a hold of, and then that would be able to cultivate, when you repitch that yeast log and it's not too strong, but in more modern terms, we as brewers, typically when we think of dry yeast, we're actually talking about like an active dry yeast, and that's something that we attribute to Fleischmann's, which is they produce bread yeast, active bread yeast, and they produced dry yeast during World War II. And it had so many advantages where it stored better. It didn't require refrigeration. It didn't lose viability as quickly, and that's a huge perk that the brewing counterparts still share today. Like, it's definitely in the pros column of dry yeast as far as that goes. But we started with that origin, right? That we have this active dry yeast that Fleischmann's is using, despite the fact that, brewers have been finding a way to use dry yeast for hundreds of years.
So I'm going to get kind of hung up on this word active because I just made some pizza. In fact, we postponed recording the show because I wanted to make some pizza, the dough of which I threw together a couple days ago using Fleischmann's active dry yeast. It looks exactly like the yeast that's in the packets that I have. So am I to assume that dry brewer's yeast is also quote unquote active as well?
Yes. Yeah. It's active dry yeast.
So do we know what the active actually means? Like does that just mean it's like ready to go, or?
So it's not necessarily that it's ready to go. Because, and we'll talk about that a little bit. There's a lot involved in the yeast. Like, the natural use of yeast is with it hydrated, with the cell membrane needs water to do its job effectively. Right. But you have a lot of other things like, instant yeasts and then nutritional yeast. Like, so for example, a nutritional yeast may go through a process that renders it unable to perform fermentation or unable to process sugars, and that would, very much so not an active yeast, right? Like, very inactive. And that's something like you may take that as a nutritional supplement. I think even brewer's yeast is popular with some people. I've
seen it on the shelves of hippie stores. Yes.
Yeah, I've seen it. And I guarantee the actual, the long explanation versus active versus inactive versus nutritional versus, et cetera, so forth. I guarantee there's a lot more nuance to it, but when you boil it down, that's what it comes to.
Gotcha.
But as we've sort of been developing these practices, we've gotten a lot better at producing dry yeast. And it kind of helps that it's been a really popular thing, not just in brewing, but also in the making of bread and the production of other foodstuffs. So like we just suggested, like, the process of drying yeast is fairly straightforward. Like, if you think about how, those yeast logs, the wood sticks, were dried, it's effectively exactly what it sounds like. You have you have wet yeast, you either have like sunlight or I think some people had like fires, but temperature is a big thing here. But you dry that yeast out, quickly drying it, preparing it for the next batch, and it shouldn't, in theory, damage it too much.
That's an issue with dry yeast that I've heard. It's not like I sit around and just talk about the difference between dry and liquid yeast all day long, but I have engaged in some nerdy conversations in my day. And one of I was chatting with the folks from Fermentus, they're the ones who make the popular USO5 and SO4. And they were saying that the reason I was asking about availability of different strains and why theirs are so limited compared to other ones. And, my question really was, why can't you just take any popular liquid strain and dry it out? And they were saying that there's something about the drying process, and I didn't understand it, admittedly, but that makes certain strains, essentially, they're unable to dry those, like, certain strains out.
Yeah, but on that note, and this is something we'll talk about as we go forward. One of the brilliant things about the way we've evolved technology in the drying of yeast, and the more we've understood it, there is so many strains available to us now that not even 5 years ago that wasn't available.
Dude, yeah.
It's insane, like how many yeast strains are available as dried yeast now.
Yeah. Well, and also, and this goes a little bit away from dried yeast, but this idea that, you've got these 4 big companies. Let's just take Fermentus, White Labs, Yeast, and Imperial, and all of them have a Chico strain. Well, we've done some comparisons, and each one of those strains, each one of those labs actually took an isolate from some source. We're all going to guess that that source is a bottle with a green label on it. They took an isolate, so one cell or however many cells they do. I'm no microbiologist, but then they went and propagated, and what they're marketing now as the Chico strain, whatever their names are for it. But even those have kind of a intra strain differences. I think a lot of people would agree with. You take US-05 and ferment a beer with it, and is it going to be different than a beer, say, fermented with Imperial's A27, their flagship?
Yeah, it's certainly possible, and there's a lot of things that come into that. Is it the dehydrating process? Is it the rehydrating process? Is there something to do with the way the cell wall takes in sugars during that process? Or is it, like you mentioned, like is it the isolate? Or is it the handling of that? But talking about like dry yeast, we've mentioned a little bit about how the way it's been done traditionally, maybe not very sterile. And talking about like the different isolates, it's easy to see how if you don't have a really sterile process, or if you don't have a really controlled process, that can cause a lot of problems.
Well, dipping a wood stick in a yeast cake and then letting it hang to dry sounds pretty sterile to me.
I think there's a lot of ways that brewers figured out, So one of the things, and we can go back check Lars' blog for this because he obviously experienced this more firsthand than I did. But the use of ash in the drying process, ash is sterile, and using different compounds, like it's sort of the same way we've arrived at most things as brewers. Like, oh hey, this thing I did, the beer was better this time, and just rinse and repeat, and
and now we make it dogma.
So exactly. So it's incredible like how far we've come in that regard,
for sure.
But I think we've talked about the basics of yeast and yeast production so far on this podcast, so I'm not going to go into too much detail there. But essentially the steps are fairly similar, right? Like you have propagation, so you've selected your strain, and then through multiple fermentation steps, you will build that cell count. Then you have harvesting, with a centrifuge or something similar, you'll start to compress those yeast solids, like the yeast mass, and then filter out anything else there, and then the packaging is really where we're interested at. Like that's where we're going to start to diverge a little bit in how we handle this. So after the yeast is put into like a filter press or a rotary vacuum, something that is going to further concentrate it, it's going to make those yeast solid. It's going to do further compression. Yeast is blended with cutting oils and an emulsifier. So in emulsifier, and I want to make sure we talk about this just because it's something I had to research like extensively. Like I asked a lot of people about like what the hell this is doing and why the hell it's being used. But I've got a couple dry yeasts in my fridge pretty much at any given time. And that's just for like, if I have a backup, or if I want to have like a short and shoddy brew day and I don't feel like doing a yeast starter for whatever reason, I've got some. And I pulled out my yeast for this episode, and I've got some Mangrove Jack, I've got some Fermentus, I've got some Lallemand, and I guarantee I've pronounced that wrong. So someone please send Jason a support email and let me know how to pronounce that properly. But anyways, those are all packaged with an emulsifier, specifically E491, which is sorbitan monostearate. But anyways, what an emulsifier does is it coats the yeast cells and protects the cells from damage by oxygen and assists in the rehydration of the yeast. So at this stage, during this packaging stage, yeast companies will make sure the yeast is packaged with, adequate carbohydrates and nutrients to aid in that rehydration, as well as the combination with an emulsifier, something to make sure that, and that's where you can see, like, you get those really granular dry yeasts, like they're very clumped together.
Yeah.
If you ever look at that, it's not just because they're dry, because like if you were just to dry yeast just flat, yeast is super small. You know what I mean? Like it would be a really fine powder had you just had pure dried yeasts.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So all of the stuff, this emulsifier and stuff that they use in essence to ensure a quality product, it sounds like, that's why dry yeast looks the way it does.
Yeah. Emulsifier, it's basically like the way it's described online, it's like a wax, essentially.
Yeah.
But it's something it's clumping, it's aid, and then the cutting oil is going to play a small role in that. But it's going to aid in its primary purpose is to aid in that rehydration, and to prevent that damage of oxygen.
Right. And to be honest, if this is bringing back memories of my conversation with the Fermentis folks, I think that's the step that certain strains can or can't tolerate, and it may have something to do with like cell size or something like that.
That could certainly be, and I think there's a lot of steps in this process where it could definitely go astray.
Yeah.
And part of that I think is like the packaging I think packaging is the big part, and then packaging with adequate carbohydrates and nutrients.
Yeah.
And this is actually one of the steps we'll talk a little more in depth about when we talk about like the usage of dry yeast, but there's some as far as I understand it, there's some experimentation going on in the dry yeast production communities on that step specifically, right? Like I think our friend Chino mentioned recently that there's a yeast company he was talking with who was exploring ways to make yeast better suited for direct pitching, like trying to think about like, well, what can we do at this packaging step, or what can we package the yeast with to make it more resistant to the essentially hostile environment of directly pitching the dry yeast.
Right, the yeast, the whole yeast shock
liquid
thing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and I'm sure we're going to get to this in a bit, but I do recall just recently, within the last month or two, didn't Fermentis come out and say that they are now recommending people direct pitch and not rehydrate first?
Yes, like they effectively are saying like, yes, we recommend this direct pitching step, and that has to do with the way it's produced.
That's fascinating to me, just given how many times we've all had it force fed to us that you need to rehydrate just because based on viable cell loss when due to that shock when you add that dry yeast to the wort. So fascinating stuff. Yeah.
Yep. And we'll talk about that too. But then, the last step in that production is pretty clear. Like it's packaged under a vacuum or in a nitrogen environment. Basically we're doing so much prior to this to try to make sure that it's not damaged by oxygen, that it makes sense to remove oxygen from the packaging step.
Yeah.
And if you take a look at the packaging on different yeast brands, like you'll see plenty of evidence for all of this. You'll see the emulsifier E491. You'll see things that say like packaged in a protected atmosphere or vacuum sealed or something along those lines. But effectively, then once you have that dried yeast, it's been packaged in a protected atmosphere. It has a lot longer viability than a liquid yeast counterpart. They are typically packaged with a lot more. Like in an 11-gram packet, you usually have about 200 billion yeast cells, which is what Imperial Organic is one of the first like liquid yeast companies who's selling that much to homebrewers, like per pack. And that was like, for a long time, that was the big advantage of dry yeast, was that you could get 200 billion cells, whereas, with Y-yeast or White Labs or another liquid yeast, you were getting 100 billion.
Yeah, it was definitely the brewer who didn't like to plan brew days could just go out, cut open a pack or two, depending on the OG of their beer, and not have to worry about making a starter or propagating yeast, whatever. And I've definitely done that hundreds of times. Probably.
that was what. When I was, like I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, like when I was brewing in the beginning, I was recommended dry yeast purely based off that, because I didn't have the stuff. I didn't have like the equipment to make a starter. I didn't have really the interest in making a starter at the time. And so people recommended dry yeast to me.
Yeah.
So there's definitely some advantages.
Yeah. It's awesome. Well, so you got this dry yeast in the package. We mentioned it a little bit earlier. There's at least been a lot of, kind of like down talking the way a lot of us like to use this dry yeast, because it's easier just to cut the top open and pitch it directly onto your. I still use dry yeast almost exclusively for my hard cider. I love Belle Saison. That's Dan's star product for my hard cider, and I still sprinkle it on the top, and then thankfully this paper came out a few months ago and is kind of validating my my process here. But let's talk a little bit about ways to use dry yeast.
So I mean, like you, especially ciders and meads, I pretty much exclusively use dry yeast. Now I do rehydrate. So that's another way. So we'll start from the top. Like the first way that people are typically using it is the way you mentioned, just a direct sprinkle of the dry yeast into the wort or must or whatever it is we're producing. And the pro is that this definitely saves time. It's
easy.
It's way easier.
Yeah.
In argument, it's more sterile. It's definitely coming from a sterile pitch directly into what is in theory sterile wort.
Right.
Is in theory safer than, making sure that your rehydration vessel is sanitized, making sure the water that you rehydrate with is sanitized, so on and so forth.
All of those are just added vectors for contamination.
Correct.
There are some things that I've heard in my day about direct pitching. Like if you're gonna do it, like if you have to direct pitch, make sure that you pitch and you leave that raft of dry yeast on top of your liquid, your wort, your must, whatever it is, because you don't want to shake it up. And I've never understood, why you wouldn't want to do that.
Yeah. So we see that recommendation all the time. And it's also one of the steps in rehydration is that effectively, by sprinkling it on top, you're giving the yeast time to acclimate itself to that environment without essentially, drowning it and forcing it throughout that solution. And on the topic of rehydration, that's another way that yeast is being used. And essentially the goal of that step is just to reintroduce that water that was lost during the drying process so that it can return to working order. And it's a bit of a misnomer. Effectively, when we say rehydration, we mean rehydration outside of the fermentation environment, or outside of the wort or must or whatever we're producing, because the first thing the yeast does when you pitch it is it's going to start rehydrating. So when we talk about the rehydration step, we just mean actually having a dedicated small vessel and specific liquid for rehydration. And in theory, this has a couple positives other than just the direct pitching. Like you mentioned earlier, just the direct pitch is often spoken out against in terms of dry yeast, and ultimately, I've seen suggestions that improper rehydration of dry yeast, which would include, pitching directly into wort, could cause as much as 60% loss in viability to the number of pitch cells, and that typically comes about because, this is actually per White and Zainasheff in their book Yeast. Cooler temperatures can cause more materials leaching out of the cell during rehydration, out of the cell wall during rehydration. So that can cause a lot of damage to the cell itself, permanent damage that isn't necessarily going to be repaired once the wall is rehydrated. The other issue is, that osmotic pressure, the osmotic shock that we've talked about before in different contexts. If you just directly pitch something into wort, you're introducing a lot of sugar and, also nutrients, but sugar to the yeast when it isn't really in an ideal state to be handling that environment, and also in a state where it's not doing a great job of, I guess I will say, not navigating, but handling what's coming in and out of the cell wall. The things that transition in and out of that membrane, it doesn't do a great job of that. So it can be really damaging to the cell, can cause that loss in viability, which, for some low gravity worts, that 100 billion cells might still be fine. That do it okay. But obviously for a lot of beers, that may not necessarily be the case.
Yeah, you're taking this packet of yeast that you are ostensibly using because of its high cell count, and based on at least a fairly limited amount, I think, of research, by dry pitching, we've all been told at least that you're now basically just saying, well, adios to 40 to 50% of those cells.
Yeah, exactly. And so, the last way that I see people tend to be using dry yeast is making starters, kind of the same way that we would with a liquid yeast, really with the goal and intent of building viability, building that cell count. And I think also to ensure maybe the vitality, like to make sure that the pack is still good, make sure it's fermenting, all that good stuff. So they'll just, rehydrating the yeast and then spinning it up with some DME or LME. Zanishev and Palmer in Brewing Classic Styles have actually cited that, this isn't needed. It's just cheaper to buy another pack of dry yeast if you need more cells.
Yeah, that's the argument that I've heard when it comes to making starters with dry yeast is that, dry yeast is so cheap that you're going to spend more in malt extract to make your starter than you would on another packet of yeast. But, I punched it out one time back when I did an experiment on this. And I don't think that's true anymore. I mean, depending on where you buy your your ingredients at.
I also don't think it's true. Maybe if you're buying like really small amounts of DME at a time.
Sure.
If you buy like 3 to 12 pounds, which 12 might be a lot for some people. I realize that now, but 3 pounds seems reasonable. But 3 pounds, it's really not that much. Yeah. And then the other, on top of that, there's an increasing argument I'm seeing people talk about online, which I haven't seen a lot of evidence for, is that using a starter, like you mentioned, like there's yeast companies recommending direct pitching now, like the opportunity for that. One of the arguments is that using a starter will exhaust the nutrient reserves that were packaged with that yeast.
Yeah.
So if you have a dry yeast that was packaged with the nutrients that are ready for it to get going, just right off the bat, and you make a starter, then it's going to utilize those nutrients. And it won't necessarily have access to them in the environment that it was intended for.
Right.
Which could be good or bad. I don't think there's enough to say right now that like, this is a really detrimental thing or, this is a good thing. But it's an argument that's, I think, ongoing, especially as more companies are saying, let's explore direct pitching because that's the way a lot of brewers are just doing this.
Well, I've heard the same argument. And again, I'm no expert, so all I have is to look up to these guys who are recommending that I not make a starter with dry yeast.
Right.
And it sort of makes sense. They put all this care into building up this product, this dry yeast products for a specific way of being used, I guess. So I guess I'll have to trust them. Well, I tend to stick with liquid yeast for most of my brewing still these days, but I've had a ton of experience using dry versions with good results, and we've done some interesting experiments to test some of these ideas we just discussed out. Results when we return.
When dumping wort-soaked grain and leftover low-gravity wort while cleaning up after a brew day, do you ever wonder what your true efficiency would be if that wort made its way to the kettle instead? Using the brew bag, a fabric filter for all mash tuns and brewing methods, allows you to capture every last drop of wort. Not only does this increase kettle efficiency, it lowers your grain bill, which saves you money. Throwing wort in the trash is like dumping a 12-pack down the drain and just doesn't make sense. Use the brew bag and leave no wort behind. I've been using these filters for a long time and recommend them to everyone. I never have to worry about a stuck sparge and cleanup is fast and easy. Go grab yourself a brew bag fabric filter at brewinabag.com and be sure to use code TBP17 at checkout to get a discount on your order. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the super fast counterflow chiller, the exGEERiments, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to exGEERiments.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single, compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
So one of the greatest things about dry yeast, in my opinion, is how incredibly easy it is to use. Just cut open the top of the packet and sprinkle it on top of your wort, which according to some is poor practice that results in immediate yeast death. So back in 2014, fearful that my sprinkling this dry yeast onto my wort was going to potentially ruin the beer, I decided to put it to the test. I made a 10-gallon batch of Munich Dunkel and split it between two identical carboys, plastic carboys. And they were treated exactly the same with one exception. For one of them, I pitched the yeast right on top of the wort. And the other one, I rehydrated in 94 degree Fahrenheit water for 15 minutes. And then I actually put that warm, rehydrated yeast into my fermentation chamber so that it would drop to be about 10 degrees Fahrenheit within the temperature of the wort that I was aiming for. I'd read somewhere that, you don't want to shock the yeast, so they have to be within 10 degrees or 15 degrees Fahrenheit in order not to shock the yeast. So I pitched the yeast. Both of the yeasts were pitched at the exact same time. I wanted to kind of track fermentation. And then I noticed that the next morning, both had already started fermenting. I believe it was the next morning. And they looked the same. So at this point, it didn't look like there was really much of a difference, at least in terms of when fermentation kicked off. I did notice that the yeast that I pitched the dry yeast into, that beer, the kreuzen on it fell before the rehydrated yeast pitch beer, which was pretty interesting to me because
that's super weird.
Yeah, it seems to indicate to me that maybe the dry yeast pitch actually fermented things a little bit faster.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, that would definitely be contrary to what we would expect from something like this. Yeah. But I mean, like if the kreuzen fell first, I wonder why else that would be.
Yeah. It was an interesting observation, to say the least. I let the beers finish up. I wanted to make sure that they were looking about the same before I took hydrometer measurements to find that both FGs were exactly the same. They were both at 1013 SG. And so those were identical. So we didn't find any differences in terms of attenuation or anything like that. And now this was back in the early days of Brewlosophy, where I didn't have nearly as many friends who wanted to subject themselves to the experimental cause. So I served these beers. They were kegged the same. They were carbonated to the same level. Everything, again, they were treated identical with the exception of the variable. I served these beers to 13 participants is all, which I believe would require about seven or eight in order to imply a statistically significant finding, but only 5 people, so just over 1/3, were able to identify the unique sample in this one, indicating to us that the beers just weren't that different. Pretty surprising to me, seeing as I had seriously bought into this whole idea that rehydration was necessary.
Definitely. And I mean, like I mentioned earlier, I still rehydrate everything. So looking at this one, just was crazy to me, especially because Nottingham is a yeast I have a lot of experience with. Like it's, a lot of people recommend it for a lot of English beers, obviously, and then ciders, because, like you sort of demonstrated here, it can ferment pretty cool.
Yeah, for sure.
And used. So it's crazy to me that this ended up the way it was. And it's one I would love to see us do again.
It's interesting to me. I often find myself, perhaps more now because of the experimental stuff that we're up to, but I find myself kind of considering where I got these ideas that I adopted so vehemently, like how they developed in me and how I became such a believer. Because when I think about like rehydrating yeast now, even before this paper came out, I think it was Fermentus who put this paper out saying that you should, just go ahead and pitch it dry. The only thing that the psychologist in me is looking and saying, dude, that's classic appeal to authority. You heard one person or a couple of people say that you should rehydrate it. And then all of a sudden you're like the expert on yeast rehydration. When I do this experiment and, side by side, I'm drinking these beers next to each other and I can't tell them apart at all. I didn't have a preference for one over the other. I remember the beer ended up not being that great. But that doesn't matter. They also tasted identical to me. And, the folks that I talked to after doing this experiment kind of said the same thing. And so I'm left here with kind of this nugget of data, like this real life results, that at least in my mind is way more practical than what somebody said or what I heard through the grapevine as being the best way to do it. I just think it's a really fascinating kind of phenomenon, and I'm sure it's the same in most hobbies out there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, something that I think is interesting about this is like, obviously, so you didn't use like a GoFirm or some kind of rehydration nutrient.
No, I did not.
So you just had what it was, and in theory, so obviously, I'm maybe not quite as dogmatic as Malcolm tends to be, as much as I love him, of course, as much as I love him, obviously, I think there's going to be some thermal shock if you do, if you pitch your yeast at a wildly different temperature. There will be some osmotic pressure problems, and there's going to be some other damaging issues, but at least in this case, it doesn't look like the damage was severe enough to really make a difference in that specific wort.
Right.
And so that's what's crazy to me, right? Is like, well, if this doesn't matter in this context, or if it did make a difference in this specific context, what other context can I just pitch yeast into?
Yeah.
And just throw yeast at? Because I'm fine with that. I'll do it.
Well, no, you make such a good point too. I think that's a big thing is that perhaps there was a difference, maybe, and maybe not as well, but maybe, the yeast that went into the wort directly, maybe that it responded differently and there were some issues, but that it didn't produce or any, none of the problems that could manifest from that either did or they were so small as to be unnoticeable. And I think that's fascinating. Right. Obviously, the other big area my recollection at least is always never make starters with dry yeast. Not only because buying a couple of packets is said to be, a little less expensive, but there could be issues. And so contributor Jake Houlihan put that one to the test. But first, I want to remind everyone about our rad sponsor, Brewers Hardware, who specialize in triclover compatible sanitary fittings, conical fermenters, kettles, and brew stands. Brewers Hardware offers a variety of unique items for home and craft brewers, including high-quality stainless fittings at great prices and super fast shipping. Anyone looking to go electric also needs to check out their BCS 482 control system. It provides everything needed for total brewery automation. Learn more at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. So Jake, curious about claims that you shouldn't make a starter with dry yeast, designed a really interesting experiment to test this one out.
Back in December of 2016, Jake decided to put this whole starter versus rehydration issue to the test. And what he ended up doing was he so for his rehydration, he put water in a mason jar. I think he made a version of your tiny bottom pale ale.
Yummy.
Or he said tiny-ish bottom pale ale. I think it was maybe a little higher gravity. Yeah. But anyways, he made this pale ale, and for one of the batches, he put water in a mason jar equal to 10 times the weight of the dry yeast pack, which is our standard rule of thumb for rehydration. He let that sterile water cool to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 35 degrees Celsius, and then added a pack of the Saf Ale US 05 for rehydration. And that just, that's the Chico strat. Pretty straightforward. For the other batch, he made a starter. He made a large starter of a same pack of US-05, not accounting necessarily for, the viability of that yeast, like the yeast cell count involved, because I think that's one of these instances where it's a function of the variable that we're testing.
Yeah, I remember talking with Jake about this when we were designing it. And he was like, "How do we get around? What do I do? Like, it's all projection at this point. He's not going to plate it up and count it. So he's like,
it's a total crapshoot.
Yeah, exactly. He's
absolutely.
like, so do we just say that if you make a starter, you're pitching more yeast, and that's a function of the variable? If there's a significance, we can't say whether it was because the starter did something good or bad, but we definitely know that there's going to be some propagation going on, and so we just decided to include it and see where things would pan out from there."
Exactly. And so kind of like you would think, Jake observed that the starter, that batch actually kicked off faster. Right. It was faster. It had a stronger fermentation sooner during that cycle. And that kind of continued throughout the case, like even the next day when the rehydrated sample was, much more vigorous of a fermentation, it still looked like the starter was a little stronger than the rehydration. So, so far it's looking like these are going to be different. And he also noticed that the yeast dropped out of the starter before it dropped out of the rehydrated fermenter. If you go look at the article on the website, Jake has some great pictures of this, and it's really interesting to see just the color difference that the presence of yeast makes in the fermenter, like before it's dropped out.
So the rehydration batch, I think it's safe to say that making the starter, it's going to improve both viability as well as vitality. It did seem to kick fermentation into high gear. I mean, that yeast was ready to go when it hit that wort. Whereas with the rehydrated yeast, it may have been, built up or whatever in kind of this ideal environment, but those yeasts weren't hitting the ground running, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. But Jake waited it out. He waited until, it seemed like both were about finished with fermentation. And he took his own final gravity sample and saw that both had fermented down to 1006. So both had hit the same final gravity, which is crazy. And
it's the same with the first experiment we talked about.
Exactly.
You're treating these yeasts pretty differently to start with, but they end up doing the same thing. It's like they know where they want to go and they get there, just maybe a little bit slower than expected.
Yeah, I've done experiments that have nothing to do with the final gravity, and they end up at different final gravities.
That's because you're a bad brewer, Matt.
That's actually probably it. Just full disclosure for everyone.
Right.
Anyways, now that the beers have been finished, they've been packaged up. Jake got a sample of 25 people for this experiment. And out of that sample size, he would have needed 13 people to correctly select the odd beer out to say that these beers were reliably distinguishable from one another. And only 6 selected the odd beer out.
That's not even a third.
Which is so low. It's so low.
Yeah.
But so, based on that, we can't really say that the starter batch could reliably be distinguished from the rehydrated batch, and Jake himself couldn't tell a difference. He didn't get any of his triangles right.
Yep, he said these beers tasted exactly the same to him. I think when you've got 6 out of 25, just a little bit on the way the triangle test statistic works. When you serve people 3 things, you expect randomly, if they're exactly the same, equal amount of number of people will choose each sample. Right? That's if they're exactly the same. So you expect to see 1/3 of the sample pool to select, each one of the samples that they're trying. When you say something is significant, when enough people over 1/3 identify the same sample, then you could say, well, that one, there's some evidence that this one is definitely different, right? In this one, less than 1/3, not by much, but
not much at all.
I'd say really it's closer to about 1/4 of the people picked the right one, which just means that again, that's the way randomness works. People were probably randomly guessing. I don't usually say that with such, confidence, but in this one, I have to believe, given my experience with, I've done starters with dry yeast before in the past, it doesn't seem to cause any detriment to the beers that I've made doing that. So I've got my anecdotal experience, and then you got this data here. I just think it's kind of the hitting that ball home.
I agree. And it is, I mean, if nothing else, looking at these experiment results, if you're concerned about the number of yeast cells that you're pitching with a dry yeast packet, it looks like a starter is a totally valid way to go. Yeah. It definitely didn't cause a problem in terms of, we mentioned, like possibly exhausting that nutrient reserve. We have also said maybe it's just a little more expensive, which I don't really think is true.
Not these days.
Based on that, if you don't want to spend the money on dry yeast, you've got maybe some DME at home, or if you just you want to bring it up a little bit but don't want to drop the money on entirely another pack of yeast, spin up a starter. Doesn't seem to have any problems.
Well, and kind of on the other side of that coin, if you don't feel like making a starter or rehydrating your yeast, just pitch your dry yeast into your wort. There is so much anecdote out there from people who pitch dry who will tell you that it works totally fine. I was recently talking to a professional brewer who uses the Fermentis 3470 for all of their lagers, and I forget exactly what size. I think he was saying 15 barrel batches, and he goes, "Yeah, we cut open the pack that we get from the distributor, and we just toss it in, and it rips away. It does a great job." So, I think you can kind of choose what you want to do. I do think that it's worthy of questioning sometimes some of the information that we've been told, and kind of trying to consider the data that is out there consider what you're going to do in light of the data that's out there. Matt, what are if you're using dry yeast, what are you doing these days based on the experiments we've done?
Man, so based on the experiments, for some of these higher gravity things I've been doing, like if I'm making a mead or if I'm making something really big, a big beer, I still rehydrate, and I still try to get it acclimated to that higher gravity environment. But I do that with with even liquid yeast. But probably the past 5 or 6 ciders I've made, and the last session mead I made, I just been straight pitching it.
Yeah.
I haven't. I mean, and I aerate it. I have yeast nutrients and stuff, so there's still some precautions in place to try to provide a better environment for the yeast. But I've been straight pitching it, no problems.
That's basically where I'm at as well. I very rarely use dry yeast anymore these days, at least for beer. Like I said before, when I make hard cider, which I make, a batch of hard cider every 6 to 8 weeks, I'd say. I almost always exclusively use Dan Starr's Belle Saison, which I just sprinkle on top of the treetop apple juice, and it has always worked for me. I've never had an issue with that. And so, I'm not going to fix what's not broken. And I have to admit that, it's the results like the ones from these experiments that kind of validate me. Well, Matt, do you have anything else to say on dry yeast before we get going?
No, man. I mean, the same thing I like to leave with every single time. It's totally worth just trying it out.
Yep.
It's so, there's anecdotally speaking, you're going to be fine. It's going to be great. So
I think so
try
too.
and give it a shot.
I think so. Well, that's all the time we've got for this episode. To read more about the experiments we discussed in this show, as well as all the other stuff we are up to, you can head over to brewlosophy.com. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through no middleman.